Do you know for sure what the Activate Approach command does for instrument pilots? And have you ever wondered why controllers in the U.S. use vectors for approaches far more than in other countries? And which do you feel is less work, flying with vectors or via own navigation? And just what are the downsides to loading an approach with an IAF versus vectors? Please stick around because we'll answer those and other listener questions about vectors to final. Hello, my name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. If you're new to the show, take a moment right now, reach out there, touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Last week, we talked about rules for vectoring aircraft and how it relates to the crash of November 188 Papa Charlie, a Pilatus PC-12 that crashed in Texas. If you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/307. But first, let me remind you, this is a listener-supported show, and we have several new ways that you can show your love and support for the show. Just go out to our new support page at, guess what, aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via PayPal, Venmo, the Cash App, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Coming up in the news for the week of December 25th, 2023, an SR-22 crashed this week in Texas, and we'll tell you why. Vans is back in business, but will be increasing kit prices. And we'll tell you how a helicopter medevac crew dealt with a drunk pilot who was slumped over in his seat. All this and more, and the news starts now. From aviation-safety.net, SR-22 crashes at night in Texas. A Cirrus 2008 SR-22 GTS G3 Turbo impacted a house while on approach to land at Tailwind Air Park, Thompson Field, that's 1 Tango Alpha 7, in Edgewood, Texas, and the pilot was killed. ADS-B data shows the aircraft approaching the private air park's unlit runway almost an hour after sunset. The aircraft's track data appears to be offset by several hundred feet from the center line. Sadly, there was another airport with a lighted runway just 2 miles away from this private air park. Now, it's worth noting that private airfields are not displayed in many common GPS navigators. Over the years, I've read about several similar aircraft accidents where pilots have attempted to land on unlit runways and it didn't turn out well. Obviously, this is very dangerous and should be avoided at all costs. From avweb.com, most Vans customers agree to price increases. About 60% of the first Vans aircraft customers contacted have immediately agreed to continue with their orders despite an average 32% price increase and reduced flexibility in customizing their aircraft. At a bankruptcy court hearing into the company's Chapter 11 filing, the company reported about 300 of the first 500 customers on the notification list signed new agreements within 24 hours of receiving formal notification from Vans. Those who agree will have any deposits they paid for kits or parts applied to the final cost of their orders. Those who don't accept the new deal will lose their deposit to the pool of unsecured creditors. From generalaviationnews.com, the FAA wants your input on weather products. The FAA is asking pilots to participate in its new weather survey. The FAA Aviation Weather Division, or AWD, is collecting information from pilots to help assess convective weather products. Specific objectives for the Weather Information Modernization and Transition Convective Weather Survey are to identify convective weather products used by the aviation community, determine overall usability of these products, determine overall preference of these products, identify optimal convective weather products to support decision-making, identify weather products that do not support the decision-making process, and identify weather products that do not support the decision-making processes. The data collected will be analyzed and reported as group data. No personal identifying information will be collected or reported. And I've included a link in the show notes where you can take the survey. From yahoo.com, panel to review U.S. air traffic control fatigue after near-miss incidents. The FAA is naming a panel of experts led by a former safety board official to address air traffic controller fatigue after a series of near-miss incidents. The FAA is facing a persistent air traffic controller shortage that has caused flight delays. At many facilities, controllers are working mandatory overtime and 6-day work weeks to cover staffing shortages. FAA Administrator Mike Whitaker said he has asked the panel, led by former NTSB board member Mark Rosekind, a sleep expert, to make recommendations in about 6 weeks. The 3-member panel will begin work in January and, quote, examine how the latest science on sleep needs and fatigue considerations could be applied to controller work requirements and scheduling. Whitaker told Reuters he wants, quote, to have a better understanding of what the risk is of controller fatigue. He said he's concerned about the impact of long-term 6-day work weeks. The U.S. has experienced several near-miss aviation incidents this year, including some that could have been catastrophic involving apparent controller mistakes, according to the FAA and the NTSB. From AOPA.org, Congress passes short-term FAA extension. A short-term extension passed by Congress will push the FAA reauthorization deadline to March the 8th. Initially expected by September, the much-anticipated 5-year reauthorization bill has been stalled since the summer because of ongoing negotiations in the Senate over provisions related to pilot training hours and retirement age. The first extension, passed September 30th, extended the authority of the FAA through the end of the year. This second extension was passed on December 20th, shortly before the Senate was set to break for a holiday recess. The extension bill now heads to the President's desk for signature. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilot's first time flying from the right seat goes awry. This comes from an NTSB final report. The pilot reported that the accident flight was his first time flying the Cirrus SR-20 from the right seat. During the landing flare at the airport in Lake City, Florida, the aircraft floated, and he recalled that he, quote, was not able to think through how to fly the airplane with his right hand fast enough, and the nose wheel hit the runway and the airplane started to porpoise. The plane then drifted, and he attempted to land in the grass on the side of the runway. The nose wheel struck a swale and fractured, which resulted in substantial damage to the firewall. The pilot sustained minor injuries in the crash. Probable cause, the pilot's loss of control during the landing flare, which resulted in a runway excursion. And I can tell you that the first hour of landings that I did from the right seat was very disorienting. For whatever reason, the view from the right seat can look very different from the left seat. So if you're planning to become a CFI, make sure you have a CFI on board when you start practicing landings from the right seat. From avweb.com, early ice fishing bid dunks 172. The Minnesota pilot is paying a hefty price for pushing the season. According to the county sheriff's office, the pilot landed a Cessna 172 on Upper Red Lake on the morning of December 19th, and the plane went through thin ice. The pilot and a passenger were able to get out of the partially submerged airplane and were wet but not hurt. The lake was their destination, and they had planned to go ice fishing. The flight originated in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. The pilot told authorities he flew over the lake to identify a safe area to land. The landing was successful, but the absence of snow on the ice meant he couldn't slow the aircraft down, and it slid into an area where the ice was less than 2 inches thick. The aircraft was about a half mile from shore when it broke through. From knau.org, phone lines in the Grand Canyon are being removed to improve aviation safety. In the mid-1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, installed a network of telephone lines in the Grand Canyon along the Colorado River. Nearly 100 years later, park ranger Betsy Arnault is tearing down 18 miles of wires because they're a hazard for search and rescue helicopters. But her attention at first was not on the sky, it was on the ground. She said that's because a bighorn ram got caught in some wires on the Bright Angel Trail and died. He was strangled in the wires. So Arnault started picking up the fallen wires. She said they're just strewn across the ground, they're tangled in the vegetation, they're dangling from poles, and she uses bolt cutters to snip wires from the telephone poles. Jeremiah Boyd is an aviation officer for the Grand Canyon National Park. He says, just knowing that we don't have to worry about wires in that area, it allows pilots to be able to adapt and to get into some of those areas where the wires were much more easily. And as for Arnault, she says there's another benefit, that it improves the views. She says it's really nice to see just nature, just the sky. And finally, from K105.com, Kentucky pilot pleads guilty to flying air ambulance while under influence of alcohol. An air ambulance pilot has pled guilty to flying drunk during an emergency flight. The male pilot, age 46 of Louisville, pled guilty to operating an air common carrier while under the influence. He faces up to 15 years in prison. The incident occurred on the afternoon of March 21st when, while flying for Air-Evac EMS, Inc., he picked up a patient from Baptist Health Corbin for an emergency flight to the University of Kentucky Chandler Medical Center. While en route, he began flying erratically, including a loss of altitude. This caused the paramedic and flight nurse to become concerned. It was then that the paramedic observed the pilot slumped over in his seat. The crew members shouted at the pilot over the intercom on the helicopter, and after several tries got his attention. They convinced him to land at the Central Kentucky Regional Airport in Richmond, telling him that a crew member was sick, according to the plea. After landing, he was transported to Baptist Health Richmond, where a blood alcohol test was performed, which showed the helicopter pilot's blood alcohol concentration was 0.35, more than 4 times the legal limit to operate a motor vehicle. The pilot was suspended from his duties and the FAA notified. After a company review of the incident, the pilot was terminated. The patient being transported was taken to the hospital by ambulance. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, and then we'll talk about vectors to final, including many of your emails and comments, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Alexander Schmidt. He says, just a quick note to let you know that I passed my instrument check ride this week, thanks in part to your excellent and always insightful podcast. The mock instrument check ride episode was key to my success. Thank you for keeping aviation safe. And also congratulations to Eric Sutherland, who writes, just a note that I passed my commercial last week. I listened to episode 149, interview with DPE Jason Blair in preparation, and it was very helpful. Thanks for all your time and effort in creating this podcast. I learned something valuable with each episode. Well, congratulations to both of you, Alexander and Eric. And related to all of that check ride success, I want to mention that I did a listener survey earlier this year of Patreon supporters, and one thing I learned was that a very high percentage of them, in fact, it was over 50%, were working on a new rating. And since this is that time of year when people start thinking about goals for the coming year, you may want to think about what new certificates and ratings you might want to do. Now, for me, my goal is to take a helicopter instrument rating check ride sometime next year. And if you're thinking that you might be interested in doing a multi-engine rating, let me mention that we have a very nice 2021 Diamond DA42 at the club where I teach, and I'd be happy to work with you in that plane to get a multi or to help you build multi-engine time. And by the way, we also have a Cessna 182 that's equipped with a BRS parachute. So if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area or can get here and you'd like to talk with me about flying in either of those airplanes, just contact me in the usual way, which is to go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. Also, I'm going to be headed back to Knoxville in January to do my annual recurrent training for the SF-50 Vision Jet. If you have purchased one or are looking for any kind of instruction in one, please let me know, as it really is my favorite aircraft to fly. And if you're on the fence about buying one, contact me and I'll tell you why I like it so much. And if you're picking up one in Knoxville, I'll be happy to meet you there and help you bring it home and do any additional training that you'd like to do. And I want to take a moment to pass along my condolences to the Channel 6 Action News team in Philadelphia. Sadly, Chopper 6 crashed on December 20th, killing the pilot and a photographer who'd both been with the station for a long time. The helicopter went down in Washington Township, New Jersey, just after 8 p.m., as they were returning from an assignment at the Jersey shore. Now, flight tracking data shows the helicopter's altitude dropping while returning to Philadelphia. Todd Gunther of the NTSB said, quote, "Tree strike images show it was in a descending pattern. In other words, it was descending when it impacted the trees. The aircraft hit at a very high speed, and after striking trees, it fragmented." Chopper 6 was a 2013 Eurocopter AS-350 A-Star, painted in bright red, white, and blue colors. Now, I feel a small connection to WPVI as I've been on their helipad. Years ago, I used to work for CBS at what was then their owned and operated stations, WCAU Channel 10, located directly across the street from WPVI. And I once got a ride in the traffic helicopter that served numerous stations in the Philadelphia market in the 1970s, which was known as the Arco Go Patrol. And while on that flight, the traffic reporter shot some film of a fire, and we did a quick stop at the Channel 6 helipad to drop off that film before continuing the flight. My heart goes out to the families and station staff, and I can only imagine the loss they feel. Now let me pass along a flying tip that applies to virtually any aircraft that you might fly. If you're an owner, you may know this, and if you're a renter pilot, perhaps you don't. And that tip is, don't put stuff, such as your headset or iPad or anything else, on top of the glare shield, which is on top of your instrument panel. The reason is that aircraft windshields are made of very soft plexiglass, which scratches easily. Now, one SR-22 pilot who rents his plane had someone put a large scratch on his windshield, probably because they bumped a headset into the windshield as they took it on or off the glare shield. And replacing that windshield cost $6,000. A plexiglass for aircraft is very expensive, and it also takes a number of shop hours to install. And I'm sure you may think, oh, I'll never do that. I'll be careful whenever I put stuff up there. Just don't do it, because it's too easy to scratch the windshield. And once you do that, it's going to be very expensive to replace. And my thanks to new Patreon supporter Christopher Cole, who sent me a link to a YouTube video that he did of his accident that occurred in August 2015 in Sun River, Oregon. He writes, I was freshly signed off for tailwheel with a little more than 100 total hours. The winds were variable and moderate. After touching down on the mains, I started to drift off the runway and I panicked, jumped on both brakes, and immediately flipped over in the dirt. He also mentions that as part of the process, he got firsthand experience with the FAA 44709 form. Now, I don't know that that's a form per se, but for sure, 49 U.S. Code 44709 is a regulation called Amendments, Modifications, Suspensions, and Revocations of Certificates. It says in part, the administrator of the FAA may re-examine an airman holding a certificate. That re-examination, by the way, is generally referred to by pilots as a 709 ride or a 709 check ride. And if you have to do one, you'll be doing that re-examination with an FAA inspector who has the power to pull your certificate. So if you ever find yourself in that situation, you may want to get some additional flight instruction before the 709 ride so that you perform your best. Christopher says the video gives a better explanation of what happened, including the 709 ride, and I'll include a link to it in our show notes. And I recently came across a website that says it has rare historical photos of the inside of the Hindenburg Zeppelin. Now, they were kind of fun to look at, as generally when we see photos of the Hindenburg, it's in flames. It also says that the Hindenburg made 36 Atlantic crossings. The trips took about 4 days in each direction, and a one-way ticket was about $400, which is around $8,700 in today's money. And I'll include a link in the show notes if you'd like to see those photos. And from Kansas.com, the Classic Learjet Foundation in Wichita has purchased the first Learjet, November 200 Yankee, and plans to restore it to flying condition. They paid off the airplane a couple months ago, and they're currently working to secure a lease agreement on a facility where the restoration work will be accomplished. They say the reason they're doing this is to celebrate the legacy of the Learjet brand and its history in Wichita, and to remember the hard work and dedication of the employees that worked at Learjet for the past 60 years. Now, they also mentioned that the first Learjet was delivered on October 13th, 1964. It went to the Chemical and Industrial Company of Ohio, and it says they loved it so much they later bought a second Learjet, and that Learjet set an around-the-world record flight in 1976. And if you'd like to learn more about their project and or support their work, you can go out to classiclear.org. Now, aviation is a very small community, so take a moment to see if you know any of these people. These are people just like you who listen to the show and value it, and they've also taken the few minutes of time it takes to show their love and support by making a donation, which is now easier to do than ever. We've recently added new ways to donate, including PayPal, Venmo, the Cash App, Zelle, and Patreon. And you can find links for all of these at aviationnewstalk.com/support. Now, I haven't read these names for a month, so these people all donated in the past month. First, we have 3 new people who've signed up at the upper tiers. Our first one is Mike Mendebura, who signed up at the highest level, the mentee level. Thanks so much. Mike is from New Jersey and also spends part of his time in Florida. And thanks to Frank Steves, who signed up at the instructor pilot level. And finally, thanks to Patrick Bennett, who's a mega supporter at the $50 a month level. And I'll tell you more about these gentlemen in the future. Thanks also to these people who've signed up via Patreon, including Walter Briskin, S. Montes, Rob Mark, Frank Obermeyer, John Kozlarski, Gareth Brannigan, Jason Stewart, Mike Cordosa, and Ross Comer. And special thanks to Carl Howd, who increased his pledge. We also had a number of one-time donations via PayPal, including Robert Spitaleri, J. Barry Harper, Chris Klein, who says, I really enjoy listening to your podcast and learned a lot, Tyler Trussell, Mark Vrana, Robert Shapiro, Beau DeVilliers, Michael Smith, and Stephanie Merck. And thanks to the very first 3 people to try out Venmo, my thanks to Aaron Stefanida, who says he's passed his instrument check ride, Brian Curtis, and also Douglas Fortney. And we've had 1 donation via Zelle. My thanks to LLC MN Aviation, which I think stands for Minnesota Aviation. And my thanks to everyone who supports the show in whatever way that you do. Coming up next, we're talking about vectors to final and reading many of your emails, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. We've talked about vectors to final in several recent episodes, and you've responded with more emails and comments than any recent topic. For example, listen to this one from YouTube listener George Alensmo. He wrote, "Oh wow, one of my favorite topics, yay." Who would have thought? All this about vectors to final. But apparently it's a favorite topic for you too, which is why we're talking about it again today. But before I get to your emails, I thought you might be interested in this question and answer that was posed on Reddit. The poster wrote, "Why does the U.S. use so many vectoring arrivals?" I'm comparing that to much of the rest of the world where it seems a star, which is a standard instrument arrival procedure, would have a distinct flow directly into an approach. The reason I ask is that intuitively to me, flow approaches, so ones where aircraft aren't being vectored, would impose less of a workload on the controller as the aircraft path is highly prescribed, both vertically and laterally. And here's some of the responses. One pilot wrote, "Easy. Volume traffic is lower overseas on an hourly basis compared to more U.S. hubs. Vectors give the controllers the ability to handle and meter the spacing the way they need to handle the higher volumes. Any RNAV star transitioning into an approach requires either fairly sparse traffic or the ability to meter flows hundreds of miles out to account for winds at all stratums of flight. The majority of U.S. approach controls utilize a 4-post system. Let's use ORD as an example and just simplify it to a 2-post system. For this to work, an LAX departure would need to be metered by a controller in Albuquerque to go behind an MIA departure being worked by someone in Atlanta. The sequence will be altered by a BNA departure being metered by a controller in Memphis, and the LAX departure will be resequenced by a person in Denver. Expand to 4 posts and you double the potential conflicts, and figure at any given point, ORD has 160 arrivals airborne. The complexities are staggering even without accounting for winds, compression on final, etc. Additionally, our airport layouts compared to Heathrow and Gatwick are often more complex for this sort of thing and in many cases less conducive to more reliance on RNP, which would be required navigation performance, which is what the FAA is moving to here in the U.S. He continues, one runway, such as at Gatwick, is lousy for capacity, but it's easy to meter because the runway either works or it doesn't. Compare that with a large airport in the U.S., where you may have to shuffle from 5 arrival runways to 3 or 4 runways, such as when a runway is closed for snow removal. At these complex airports, there are just more variables. The permutation of plans becomes greater. The chance of a blown attempt to meter becomes greater. At a certain point, it just makes it easier to vector an aircraft to a downwind and sort it out from there. And another person wrote, "Flexibility is the advantage. Downwinds can be extended or shortened depending upon traffic and aircraft performance." Another response was, "Good for being able to adjust traffic spacing. I'm based at Atlanta and most of the arrivals have a long downwind leg. Turning the traffic in at the ideal time has its advantages." And another person said, "Imagine 30 or more aircraft going direct to an IAF and going in for an approach. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to coordinate all of them to arrive at that point in space at the exact right time and the exact right speed for it to all work out without controller input. Throw in variables like wind, delays, weather, emergencies, traffic, TFRs, etc., and it gets even harder. The U.S. has much more traffic than the rest of the world. One day it will probably become primarily automated, but we are nowhere close to that." Now, of course, all of these comments are about the advantages of using vectors at complex airports with heavy traffic flows of airliners and business jets. And I think at smaller airports with more GA traffic, ATC is so used to vectoring the airliners that they tend to do that with GA traffic as well, if you haven't explicitly stated how you want to fly the approach, that is, whether you want to fly it with own navigation or vectors. Now let's read some of your emails and comments on our recent episodes about vectors. Now you may recall that last week in episode 307, I talked about vectors to final and I read several quotes from my Max Truscott's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook. One quote, which I'll read again in a moment, generated a number of comments and it led me to rethink what I'd written. Here's a part of the quote that I'll read from page 168. "Most pilots know the 2 ways to fly an approach, vectors and pilot navigation, also called own navigation. Flying via vectors is preferred since it's less work for the pilot, though it's more work for the controller who issues a series of vectors or turns." And then skipping further down, I wrote, "When the chips are down, e.g. you're tired, low on fuel, or the weather's rotten, request vectors as it will require less work and increase your chances for success." Now, listener Mark Colber commented on Facebook about episode 304, Vectors versus IAF Dilemma, and wrote, I heard several reasons to avoid vectors to final, but honestly didn't hear even one reason to avoid loading an IAF. Great comment, and indeed that's something I didn't address in episodes 304 or 307, though I have talked about some but not all of the downsides before. The big downside is that I see far more user errors when a pilot is receiving vectors if they load an approach with an IAF instead of loading it with vectors. And for years, I've always advocated loading an approach with an IAF when receiving vectors for the reasons we've talked about, namely that older systems display only two waypoints, the missed approach point and the FAF, when an approach was loaded with vectors. But the downside with loading an approach with an IAF when you're receiving vectors to final is the pilot must perform an additional step, which is to activate the leg of the approach that they'll be intercepting and joining after their final vector to the approach. And I see pilots screw up that extra step all the time. The reason that you want to activate that leg that you'll be intercepting is that you want the GPS flight plan to remain in sync with your position along the approach. Here's an example of why you want to activate the leg. Let's suppose you're flying the ILS-36 approach to an airport. You're being vectored to the airport, and you choose to load the approach using an IAF instead of vectors. And there are lots of good reasons to do that, especially with older systems such as the Garmin 430 and 530. After loading the approach with an IAF, none of the segments of the approach will be highlighted in magenta as the active leg because you're probably still direct to the airport. Let's say you then choose to activate the approach, something that's misunderstood by a lot of pilots. What activate approach does is it takes you from your present position to the IAF. That's all it does. It doesn't throw some magical switch in the GPS that activates something. All it does is it takes you to the IAF. Now in the Garmin G1000 and 430-530 navigators, to activate an approach, push the proc key, select Activate Approach, and then press the Enter key. But since we're receiving vectors, that's not really what we want, as we don't want to go from our present position direct to the IAF, because most likely we'll be joining the approach inside of the IAF, and since we won't have passed over the magenta line leading to the IAF, the flight plan will not auto-sequence, and it will be stuck giving guidance to the IAF as we fly along the final approach course to the airport. If we're flying a GPS approach, that's a big problem, as we won't get course guidance along the final approach course. However, if we're flying an ILS or a VOR approach, it's less of a problem, provided the CDI is selected to the nav radio and the frequency for the ILS or VOR is dialed in. So in this latter case, even though the GPS is still stuck trying to take us to the IAF, our CDI will give us course guidance along the final approach course because we're watching the CDI needle and it's tuned to the ILS or VOR. However, what if we then have to fly the published missed approach and the GPS is still giving us guidance to either the airport or the IAF? Now we're in a bit of trouble, as we'd like to be able to use the GPS to fly the missed approach. However, the GPS flight plan won't know we're at the missed approach point because it's not in sync with our position. It's still stuck trying to give us guidance to the airport or the IAF. To avoid this situation, we should have activated the leg of the approach that the controller was vectoring us toward. And while activating a leg is relatively simple, I see pilots mess it up all the time. Here's how to do it. Again, I'll be quoting from my Max Truscott's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook, and you do have a copy, right? Now, if you didn't receive one for Christmas, then you can solve that problem by ordering it for yourself now. You'll find a link in the show notes if you'd like to order it online, or you can just pick up the phone now and call 800-247-6553. On page 140 of my G1000 book, it says, to activate a leg in the flight plan, push the FMS knob and turn the large FMS knob to highlight the second waypoint that defines the leg. Then press the menu key. Activate leg should already be highlighted since it's the first choice on the menu. Press the Enter key twice to activate the leg. The magenta U-turn arrow will appear in the flight plan opposite the two waypoints that form the leg, and the corresponding segment on the navigation map page turns magenta. Now, activating a leg is not that difficult, but I still see pilots struggle to do it all the time. Here are the 4 common issues that I see. 1, they confuse activating a leg with the direct 2 key. If you are receiving vectors and you use the direct 2 key to affix on the approach, Well, you're going to be flying an angled line to that fix rather than flying along the final approach course. The analogy I use is how kids cut across the grass rather than walk along the sidewalks. If you're flying IFR, you have to follow the sidewalks, which is the route that you've been assigned. If you're VFR, you can go wherever you want, including cutting across the grass. Activating a leg provides course guidance along a segment of an approach, in other words, along the sidewalk. If you're receiving vectors and instead of activating a leg, you go direct to a fix, you're cutting across the grass and flying on an angle to that fix rather than along the approach segment. 2. Another issue is that people can't find the activate leg command. Most commonly, they push the proc key and look for it there, since that's where most of the instrument procedure commands are located. Instead, this command, along with the load airway command, is under the flight plan's menu key. The third issue is that people don't know which waypoint to highlight before pressing the menu key. Should they highlight the first point that defines the leg or the second point? The answer is that you need to highlight the second of the pair of points that define a leg. That'll be the waypoint that's further down the flight plan and closer to your destination. 4. Another issue I see is that as pilots are being vectored toward the approach, they don't know which leg of the approach to activate. In particular, if you're going to be vectored onto the approach somewhere close to a waypoint, it can be a little hard to tell if you're going to join the leg approaching the waypoint or the leg after the waypoint. And if you find yourself in this situation, there's a simple solution. Activate the leg that's closer to the airport. That way, even if you end up joining the prior leg, you'll eventually be flying over the leg you activated. And when you do, the flight plan will now be in sync with your present position. When the flight plan is in sync with your position, you get positive course guidance along the leg you're on, and the missed approach will be queued up and ready for you when you reach the missed approach point. So to answer Mark's question, when receiving vectors to an approach, a big disadvantage of loading an approach with an IAF is that you still need to do one more step, which is activate a leg. And unfortunately, many pilots have problems doing that. So with modern GPS navigators that display lots of waypoints, loading an approach with vectors is simpler, more readily understood, and more likely to be done correctly. But as some of your emails explain, there are still a number of corner cases, even with newer GPS navigators, where loading an approach with vectors doesn't provide the desired outcome. And in those cases, you will need to load the approach with an IAF, even though you're being vectored onto an approach. Now, moving on to a related topic, last week when I read from my G1000 book, I quoted a section of page 168 that a number of you took issue with, and that feedback got me to rethink what I wrote. Here's what the book says now. Quote, flying via vectors is preferred since it's less work for the pilot, though it's more work for the controller who issues a series of vectors or turns. And then later on I said, when the chips are down, e.g. you're tired, low on fuel, or the weather's rotten, request vectors as it will require less work and increase your chances for success. By the way, I wrote that section back in 2005, so about 18 years ago. And as I think about why I said that, it was probably in the context of the kind of teaching and flying that I'd been doing for the prior 5 years. During that time, there were many fewer GPS approaches, and most GA airplanes didn't have autopilots, and if they did, they didn't work very well. So if I were to rewrite that section today, I'd probably write, flying via vectors is often preferred, as it can save a little time versus flying via pilot navigation and starting at an IAF or an IF. So I no longer say that flying via vectors is preferred because it's less work for the pilot, because as many of you have pointed out, it's often less work to just start an approach at an IAF or an IF. Now here's what Patreon mega supporter Rob Thomas had to say on the issue.
Hey, Max. Rob Thomas here from Frederick, Maryland. Hey, episode 307, another really excellent show. Always learn something. I did want to get your perspective on something. You mentioned reading from your book that vectors to final was less workload for the pilot than perhaps using an IAF or an IF. For myself, I find that not to be the case. I generally always request an IAF or an IF, particularly when I'm an IMC. And the reason why is because if I feel that vectors to final is actually an increased workload. You know, I'm listening to what the controller says. There's an issue of expectation bias. There's confusion if I don't get what I'm expecting to get. And even if I do get what I'm expecting to get, I'm on heading mode. Then I've got to basically wait for a half deflection. Then I've got to get GPS mode on. Then I've got to make sure that it captures. To me, that's just a lot of work. I'd rather be able to review the approach up front, know what I believe to be exactly that I'm going to fly by doing an IF or an IAF. And then I'm just monitoring and I don't have to worry about all that other complexity. So that's just for me that works out great. Interested in your perspective on that. Again, thanks for a great show. I always learn something. I think the takeaway for me from this show was don't overreact and also, keep the autopilot on as long as possible. So thanks again. Take care. Hope you have a great holiday season.
Rob, thanks for your message and for your support of Aviation News Talk via Patreon. What you say makes total sense, and I agree with what you're doing. And if any of you would ever like to send an audio clip to me, much as Rob just did, it's really easy to do. Just go out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Question at the top of the page, and then you can record for up to 90 seconds, and that will come directly to me. Now here are more of your emails. This one comes from ATC Rick, who writes, "Big fan of your work and an avid listener of your podcast to and from work. Speaking of which, I'm one of those ATC guys, both Tower and TRACON. I appreciated your recent episode about vectors to final and the tragic accident of November 188 Papa Charlie, the Pilatus PC-12 in Texas. One thing I'd like to emphasize is that the approach controller shall assign a heading that establishes a track to intercept the final of an approach. As an instrument pilot, I appreciate the challenge a 30-knot direct crosswind can create on an approach, and I assign a vector to compensate for that wind so the intercept is 30 degrees or less. All controllers do this, or at least should, but depending upon the wind, the approach, and direction the aircraft is coming from, a 50-degree heading may be issued to achieve a 30-degree track to intercept. Keep up the excellent work and happy holidays." And that makes total sense, but I didn't recall having read that anywhere. And so I wrote back to Rick to find out where he finds this guidance in the controller handbook. And he pointed out that it was in the very section that I read that says, quote, "Assign headings that will permit final approach course interception on a track that does not exceed the interception angles specified in table 5-9-1. And I think I was thinking of headings, not tracks, when I read that. So thanks so much for clarifying that, Rick. And that makes total sense. And here's an email from Patreon mega supporter Stephen Elop. He says, "I wanted to offer even more incentive to use an IAF when loading an instrument approach, particularly on the most modern avionics and for approaches that are complicated by step-down fixes, turns at the FAF, etc. You highlighted the primary benefit of maintaining awareness about where you are relative to, for example, step-down altitudes between fixes. Modern avionics will also provide you with VNAV vertical guidance through these waypoints until you intercept the glide slope or glide path, at which point that path will become active. On the G3000, if you stay in magenta needles, which would be the GPS needles, have VNAV active, have the final approach fix altitude set in the altitude alerter, and if you have the side vertical view of your route visible on the screen, you are perfectly descended through all the step downs, even with turns in the course. You are safely lowered to the final approach fix altitude, and you can see your vertical path nicely depicted on the MFD. If you have armed the approach, you will then intercept the path down to the runway after the needles turn green, if it's an ILS. One problem with loading an approach with vectors, or activating vectors to final, is that for an ILS it will take you to green needles. There are vertical advantages to loading with an IAF, VNAVing down the approach, and letting the system switch you to green needles when it is ready. Best, Stephen. And I wrote back to him and I said, interestingly, I think the approach you describe is in minor conflict with the guidance in the FAA's AC 90-108, which I think says we should use localizer guidance anytime we're on the localizer. I don't see pilots switching to green needles immediately after joining the localizer, though I also haven't seen any issues when they haven't. I'm not sure why the FAA feels this is important, but I do try to do it all the time. And Stephen wrote back, actually, I think Garmin has made some improvements which address your concerns regarding 90-108. With current versions of at least the G3000 software, the switching to green needles has become more sophisticated. If you are following a vertical path through the various fixes on the approach, the lateral guidance switches to green localizer guidance well outside the final approach, while the vertical guidance continues to stay on the magenta vertical path guidance. Only when you get to the glide slope does vertical guidance switch to the green glide slope indicator. In other words, when you are using the new vertical path capabilities into an approach, switching to green needles now happens in 2 steps. Throughout the procedure, you can see the vertical path on the MFD if you have it configured. That really helps with vertical situation guidance. Well, Stephen, thank you so very much for that explanation and for the updates on what's new in the G3000. And here's an email from listener Jay. He had 3 points, and I'll insert my comments after each of his points. He wrote, "Thanks for the great review of Vectors to Final on Garmin products in episode 304. In our fleet, we use both older 430s and the new 650s, and mostly avoid using the VTF, that's Vectors to Final option, with one exception covered later. And I'm guessing another reason you're avoiding using Vectors to Final is because you have a mixed fleet. And this way you can use one consistent procedure that works across all of the different units." Continuing on, he wrote, "But I would like to add 3 additional reasons to not use Activate Vectors to Final. On an RNAV IAP, we have been given left turn heading 230 Vectors to Final. Once the intercept to the IF was less than 90 degrees, the vectors stopped and we got direct ABCDE fix, cross that fix at or above whatever altitude, cleared for the RNAV XYZ. Had we used Vectors to Final, we would likely not have had the IF fix in the flight plan." And just to comment on that particular point, yes, I too have been told Vectors to Final only to later be cleared for the IF. However, I almost always find the IF in my flight plan, even though we've loaded the approach with vectors. But then again, I'm generally teaching in aircraft that are less than 10 years old, and you won't see that in older aircraft. He continues on, "We have also been vectored to join and track the localizer course, but not cleared for the approach. Then after being on course, we have been given a hold for spacing at a fix other than the FAF along the final course. Again, had we used Vectors to Final, we would likely not have had that fix in the flight plan." And on this point, I agree. No question. If you load and activate an approach with vectors, there will never be a hold included in the flight plan. He continues, "Finally, we were vectored to the final approach course and cleared on an approach to then have approach clearance canceled, hold at ABCDE fix on your inbound course due to the previous aircraft being too slow to cancel IFR. Once again, we need to see those fixes along the final course to make this a smooth transition to the hold." Now, interestingly, I don't recall having been in that third situation. For sure, with older systems, you won't see the fix. With newer systems, you often will see the fix, unless there's a turn sometime after the IAF, but the hold, of course, won't be depicted. Finally, he writes, "The only reason I usually teach pilots to use Activate Vectors to Final function is if we are getting a tight Vectors to Final, where there are no intermediate fixes between the aircraft and the FAF, and the pilot is workload saturated, as it is generally easier to activate Vectors to Final than bring up a cursor to select and activate a leg, etc. And I totally agree with you on this reason to use Activate Vectors to Final. It's a very simple way to fix that number of situations that pilots get into in which their GPS navigator is not properly set up for what they need to be doing." Jay, thanks so much for your email. And DSavage5773 from YouTube makes the same point as Jay about being cleared to the IF. He wrote, "A common gotcha, which I have witnessed numerous times in my neighborhood, is when I've activated Vectors to Final and I'm receiving vectors, the controller will give the PTAC call, that's the final call where they give you your clearance, and clear us to the IF. Now the button pushing really starts in the older units that are ubiquitous. The controllers haven't a clue that this doesn't play well with the magic box in the panel." And he notes that he's a CFII. And yes, D-Savage, that's a good point, and I see that often. With the newer systems, the IF is often in the flight plan, even if you've loaded the approach with vectors. However, there's never an altitude next to it, which makes it appear to be unusable. But I often find that after loading an approach with vectors, I can still go direct to the IF, and surprisingly, the system then even pops in an altitude for the IF where there was none displayed before. But of course, if you're using an older system, the less likely this is to work, and you will be forced to reload the approach with an IAF. And thanks so much for posting your comment on YouTube. And here's an email from patron supporter Sam Dawson. He writes, "Max, another informative episode in number 304, and your discussion of Vectors to Final versus loading an IF. Another reason it can be helpful to load a logical IAF during vectors is that you sometimes get cleared to an intermediate point while in vectors for an approach. At Newark, for example, it's not unusual while being vectored for the ILS 22 left to get the clearance cleared direct gimme or IZECO, maintain some altitude cleared for the approach, or track the localizer inbound with an approach clearance to follow. A few weeks ago, one of these put me in an unusual situation. While being vectored for the ILS 4 right at Newark, we were given the clearance, Acme Global 123 cleared to Gritty, maintain 3000. Now, Gritty is a fix on the ILS, and the controller didn't give me any further clearance. I don't know if the controller forgot to give us the clearance to proceed inbound or intended to give it later, but approaching Gritty, we were still not given anything else, and I couldn't get a word in. So technically, Gritty was our clearance limit, but if we did anything other than track inbound when we arrived at Gritty, the controller would probably lose his mind. I finally got a word in about a mile from Gritty and asked, "Our clearance limit is Gritty. Would you like us to track inbound?" The controller responded, "Acme Global 123, is this your first day? Do what you always do." Still no clearance. Track the localizer inbound or do the approach. So I responded, "Approach Acme Global 123. I'm sorry, just to make things legal, can you tell me what I'm cleared for after Gritty?" The obviously irritated controller responded, "Acme Global 123, you are cleared for the ILS 4 right. Is that clear enough for you?" I bit my tongue and we flew the approach. Keep the sunny side up, Sam. And Sam, good response on your part, which was to bite your tongue. I know that is really hard to do. And sometimes people on either side of the microphone, either the controller, or the pilot, can be a little bit irritated. And for those on the opposite side of the microphone, it's usually just best to let it go. And here's an email from listener Mark Finkelstein. He says, "Max, I'm an avid longtime listener and have learned so much. I'm a proud owner of your G1000 book and a Patreon contributor. So while I have tremendous regard for your aviation knowledge, I'm going to respectfully offer a differing view on the suggestion you offered in episode 307 that tired pilots on an approach should request vectors, then own navigation. Let's take the case of a typical T-RNAV approach. If being vectored, the tired pilot will have to correctly hear and input multiple heading changes before being cleared for the approach. By contrast, imagine that the pilot requests own navigation via one of the IAFs on an arm of the T. The typical clearance would be November 123 Papa, 5 miles from Aba, cross Aba at or above 3000, cleared for the RNAV 17 approach. At that point, having loaded and activated the approach, the pilot hits APR and boom, his work is largely finished. If on autopilot, it will fly the approach without the pilot having to make any heading changes. He might have to descend the plane from 3000 to the altitude at the final approach fix, but that's pretty much it. I'd say that makes the workload for the tired pilot significantly lighter. Fond regards, Mark. Mark, couldn't agree with you more, and as I mentioned before, I think I will change what I've written the next time I update the book. Thanks so much for taking the time to send your email. Now our next email comes from Mega supporter Tim Delaney, and he poses a bit of a mystery, so I'm going to ask you as you're listening now to get in contact with me if you know the answer, because unfortunately, this gentleman's Cirrus Perspective is not operating the way I typically see these planes respond. He writes, "Max, I've owned my 2015 SR-22T since May of 2021. Ever since, whenever I fly a GPS approach, my waypoints, except the FAF and MAP, disappear if I activate vectors to final. I listened to your podcast episode 304, in which you go into great detail about vectors to final. You talk about how the waypoints no longer disappear if you fly the Perspective avionics. Back in June 2021, I had my Cirrus Service Center perform, and he listens to the service bulletin and also the software updates. He says, I went flying today with another Cirrus who owns a 2010 G3 Turbo flying with the Perspective avionics. We did the GPS 3-3 approach into KONO and VFR conditions. After loading this approach, I wanted to see what happened when I hit Activate Vectors to Final. When I was east of Parmo and heading toward Parmo, I hit the Activate Vectors to Final, and all of the waypoints except the FAF and MAP disappeared. My co-pilot friend said this always happens to him too. Any idea what is happening to my waypoints, Parmo, etc.? Thanks for your help on this puzzle." Tim, this Perspective is behaving like the older 430s and 530s and original G1000s, and that's not what I'm used to seeing when I fly in Perspective cockpits. So if anybody listening has any idea of what's going on in this particular case, please contact me so that we can help Tim. Now let's look at the email specifically about episode 307, in which we talked about the Pilatus PC-12 that flew through the final approach course in Texas and then lost control during a steep turn trying to get back onto the final approach course. This message comes from Mega supporter Jim Goldfuss in Long Island. He writes, "I was listening to the podcast and the part where you were talking about intercepting the localizer in situations where you overshoot, intentionally or not. This happened on my sim evaluation for our Part 135 company that I'm applying to. I did the Morristown 7 SID off of runway 23 at KMMU, and when I reached the top altitude and last turn, he vectored me north on a downwind to 2-3 and then base. His turn to intercept was right as the localizer started centering, and I had the option of steepening the bank or flying through and coming back on the other side. I had the distance and was well above MSA, so just flew a standard rate turn and re-intercepted the final from the other side. Talked my way all the way through the procedure. A few times this past year, I've been asked to work with pilots prepping for other similar companies' sim evaluations. They come in with the charts and approaches, and we work through each one. On paper, they can decipher an approach chart with surgical precision. But when it comes to flying, in the same situation I faced, instead of just bringing the plane around in a nice, stable fashion, many banked into 45-degree steep turns, would overshoot and then steep turn the other way to correct, and then S-turn all the way down final, and then the altitude would get out of control. I initially thought I must have missed something to overshoot final, but in thinking back to what I saw from other pilots in your podcast, I think the overshoot was intentionally set up to see how I would react and make sure I flew the plane and procedure, and not just the procedure at the expense of aircraft control. You and I both know you have to do both safely. Jim, thanks so much for sending your email. And as I think back, there have been times when, as I've gone through the final, I have done a steeper than normal standard rate turn. So I think that's a good red flag for all of us to remember. If you go through the final, just continue with standard rate turns and don't go crazy with steep turns trying to rejoin the final approach course. And here's a comment from YouTube from Charlie Foxtrot 00. He writes, "Good episode, Max. It looked to me like the plane was trying to turn hard toward D-base, which was not part of the vector or cleared approach. The PTAC, including the 030 heading, was given to the final approach fix TIMP, almost 9 miles away when he started the turn. Pure speculation, but I'm wondering if an additional contribution wasn't that the pilot's situation awareness, for what could be a number of reasons, had him fixated on D-base. That and or the confusion just led him to disconnect the autopilot, and he got disoriented as he tried to turn quickly to final. A standard rate turn in heading mode, along with slowing down to a reasonable approach speed, would have still made the 030 intercept happen well outside TIMP. Would be interesting to know what kind of RNAV equipment he had on board. The only picture of the panel I could find is likely over a decade old and shows a King Bendix KLN 90B. Suppose that will come out in the final." Charlie, interesting point. The plane would have been about 2 miles outside of the IAF D-base, so it's possible he was turning steeply to try to reach that waypoint, though that would have been counter to the controller's instructions. NTSB reports usually don't mention the specific avionics used, so we might never know unless it's visible in a crash photo. We will, though, find out how much experience the pilot had. Though oddly, even some high-time pilots lose control. Thanks for your comment. Please tell your friends about Aviation News Talk. And here's an email from one of our mega supporters on Patreon, William Kinney. He writes, "Just listen to episode 307. If I'm cleared for the approach, and it looks like I'm going to be vectored through the localizer, or perhaps they are late in clearing me, can I hit the APR key, and will the autopilot in the Perspective Plus correct the overshoot? I had one approach where I was vectored to a localizer, and it was just through the localizer when I was cleared, and it worked. Would it have been an option for the PC-12? I believe they were on a 30-degree angle, but either through or about to be through the localizer when they were cleared." William, this will work some of the time, but the autopilot in most aircraft will not make a greater than standard rate turn. So if you've flown far enough through the localizer, no, hitting the APR key will not solve the problem. You're still going to overshoot. If you hit it early enough, when a standard rate turn will still take you on to the final approach course, then yes, it should work. Now, in the case of the Pilatus PC-12, they had barely turned by the time they went through the localizer, so they were nowhere close to that final 30-degree angle as they went through the localizer. And here's an email from listener Ed Fenster. He writes, "I listened to your episode 307, and I wanted to clarify something you were unsure of. As I understand it, the track vectors on Garmin G600TXI and GTN 750XI systems cannot be set to bend to predict aircraft location based on current bank angle. I am personally experienced with and use this turn anticipation of sorts in the G1000 NXI and a TBM 900 and the G3000 and a Phenom 300, and the aircraft perfectly roll out on the center line. As such, when I started flying my Piaggio, which has a dual G600TXI GTN 750XI setup, I was confounded that I couldn't get the track vector to bend no matter what length I set it at. I emailed Garmin to inquire and was told the G600 TXI does not offer this function. Of course, if it does, and I'm just too dumb to find it, it wouldn't be the first time I got incorrect information from Garmin. Ed, thanks so much for your email. I think both you and Garmin are correct on this point. I don't fly with the Garmin 650 and 750 very often, and I believed in that episode that I hedged my comment by saying something like, and I think it's also in the 650, 750. Clearly, I was wrong. I just pulled out the Garmin GTN trainer on my iPad, and I can see that the track vector does not bend. Too bad, as it's a wonderful feature, and I would have thought they would have included the code for that in the 650, 750 since they're relatively new, but maybe they'll include that sometime in the future. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Carl Rossi about episode 302, in which we talked about a Cessna P210 that ran out of gas after a poorly flown ILS in San Diego. He wrote, Max, I find it hard to believe, or perhaps disappointing, that this pilot had over 17,000 hours, an ATP, multiple type ratings, a flight instructor certificate, and was still unable to fly multiple instrument approaches, unwilling to comply with ATC directions, never declared minimum fuel until less than 2 minutes before exhaustion, requesting VOR approach at Carlsbad despite weather being below VOR minimums. Even more puzzling that local paper is now reporting he was a Carlsbad resident. You would think he would have been familiar with the approaches at Carlsbad, and I do not think arriving at Montgomery Field before the tower closed would have made any difference. He seemed totally unable to intercept and track the localizer, and having tower there to tell him this would not have helped. It's similar to the Cessna 340 pilot you talked about earlier. The weather was not great, nor was it ridiculous. Fundamental issue was poor airmanship. It doesn't get much easier than vectors to final for an ILS or LPV. Carl, thanks so much for your email. And now here's another audio recording, this time from Patreon mega supporter Tim Delaney.
Hey, Max, Tim Delaney. As we close out the 2023 year, I just want to let you know how much I appreciate your show. I have learned so much and feel that I am a better pilot as a result of you. I want to also just give you my top 5 podcasts that you did this year that really meant a lot to me. All of them were good, but I thought I'd give you the top 5. Number 262, partial engine failure. Number 264, emergency declarations. Number 297, fatigue and the pilot. Number 305, SR-22 crash. And number 307, vectoring the final. All of them were great. Have helped me a lot in flying my Cirrus. So all the best. And I want to wish you a Merry Christmas and look forward to many more podcasts from you. Thanks, Max.
Thanks, Tim. Now let me talk about our mega supporters. This list has changed a lot since I last read it, so please listen carefully. If you're a mega supporter and you don't hear your name, contact me and let's figure out why. Now, these are the people who do the heavy lifting and provide about a third of all the support for the show. And after 2 months as a mega supporter, they get a signed book from me. Thanks so much to our 3 top-level supporters, Kevin Hendrickson, who's just bought a share of a VisionJet. Congratulations. Roy Williams, he's a VisionJet owner in Southern California who runs ASAP Home Health that provides in-home nursing services in SoCal and also trains family members to become nurses. Mike Mendeborough, who I'll be talking with this weekend. And then our next tier, we've got 4 folks. Dylan Caldwell. He's a senior AME with offices in Naples and Pompano Beach, Florida, and teenagers 17 and under do not pay for flight physicals. So if you need a basic med for second or third class physical, you can contact him at avatorsclinic.com. And in his spare time, he tows gliders in a Piper Pawnee. And Jonathan Weisswasser, a CFI who's built an RV-8 and now flies a Meridian. Also Derek Doyle and Frank Steves, who just signed up. Now for our mega supporters, those folks who are at the $50 a month level, thanks to Victor Vogel, who lives in Central PA and flies a Cirrus. Matt Souza, he's a private pilot flying a 172 out of Chicago Executive. Tim Delaney, who we just heard from, he's happily retired in Eagle, Idaho, and flies a Turbo SR-22 out of the Nampa Airport. Stephen Elop flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's now the CEO of Digital.ai, a company focused on enterprise agile software development tools. Kent Mazia, he and his wife Misty own a 2007 Cirrus at the Alpine Air Park in Wyoming and have a passion for helping others by flying volunteer missions for Angel Flight. Seth Lake, you know him. We've had him on the show numerous times. He's a DPE giving check rides in Arkansas. You can find out more about him or schedule a check ride at VSL Aero. Rick Miller, he teaches full-time in Cincinnati, and he's the chief pilot at the Lunken Flight Training Center. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation. They've got a pair of Cessna T240s and a 2021 Piper M350. Johnny McDade, singer, songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, he's a CFI, CFII, teaching in Long Island at the Republic Airport at Long Island Aviators. He also provides simulator training, and he can also provide you ground training via Facebook. You can find him on his Facebook page at Ground Point 9. Jim Hopp, he's a CFI. I see him all the time at the Palo Alto Airport, where he teaches at Advantage Aviation and specializes in tailwheel instruction. Joseph Sheehan, who flew in the Navy for 8 years, he now has a couple of hundred hours in his new Vision jet. William Birch, he donates to the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakela, he's with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses. You can find them at iflyifr.com. Stephen Bush, we've had him here on the show. He's the owner of Lone Star Helicopters in Lago Vista, Texas. He does a lot of add-on ratings from fixed wing to helicopter. It is R44, and he gives Bell Series insurance audit training for recurrent and initial training. You'll find him at lonestarheli.com. Don Delman, he's recently retired from running an airline flight department. He's a CFI, flies a Bonanza, and he's a new Cirrus CSIP instructor. Vic Bajaj, who flies here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Tim Crawford, he's a CFI with Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He owns a VTEL Bonanza and runs a company called BrainSpring that helps kids with dyslexia. Ed Kelly, who I talked with by phone recently, he flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and he says his son Bennett is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch. Michael Ron, he runs a small wealth management firm in The Woodlands, Texas, which you can find at thesumplanning.com, and he's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Ted Cussall lives in Arizona and flies an SR-22 TG5. Marlon Dutra works in tech in the Bay Area and just recently took delivery of his Diamond DA-62. Greg Campbell is a high-tech entrepreneur from Ottawa, Canada, flying a DA-40NG and working on his instrument rating. John Sendak, hospital executive in the New York metro area. He flies a SR-22 G6 based at the Republic Airport on Long Island, currently working on his commercial. Rob Thomas, he lives near Atlanta and flies a Cessna 182 with a Texas Skyways conversion. Ed Perry lives in Austin, Texas, and flies a 182 out of the Georgetown Airport. Jim Winter flies an SR-20 G3. Daniel Maddox, who we should be talking with over the weekend here, flies a G36 out of KMKC and 18AZ. Jim Gray from iRecover Treatment Centers. John Trowbridge is a doc in Humboldt, Texas, and flies his 4 Air Coupes. Dan Morris, he's a cardiovascular ICU nurse by day and commercial pilot by night, currently working on his CFI with a goal to fly charter, fractional, or medevac. Wesley Shutt. Rick Crockett flies a 172 XP with a 210 conversion and 29-inch Bush tires. He also flies a Cirrus out of Henderson, Nevada, and he's buying a Bonanza F-33. Dan Sweeney, he's a student pilot working on his private in an SR-20 at the Mike Goulian Aviation Flight School in Bedford, Mass. Sean Murray, he's a private pilot in South Africa who mostly flies a B-55 Baron and an R-44. Phil, who lives on the West Coast and plans to start instrument training soon. Phil Parham lives in Georgia and working on his instrument rating. Brian Pullman and Jeff Casson, they fly out of Morristown and Somerset airports in New Jersey, and they're partners in business compliance services that specializes in fingerprint services for the gaming, sports betting, and financial industries. Arturo Guerra, who we've had on the show, he donates in the memory of his son Arturo Jr., and he owns a software company that's created a solution for eAPIS called FlashPass. That's for folks who are going through customs internationally in their GA aircraft. You can find more about it at flashpass.net. Nick Passmore, he's a student pilot training in a Warrior in Vancouver, Australia. Jim Brosfield, who's a doctor in Tennessee. Renato Steinberg, founder and CEO of a customizable credit card called Clutch. And Renato says he'll give listeners who sign up a one-time $20 credit if they use the promo code MAX. Their website is Clutch, that's with a K, clutchcard.com. Tyler Watley flies a 172 and has a Cirrus on order. Ron Peterson, who's from Utah. Drew Anderson is a dermatologist who flies a Cherokee 235 out of Anderson, Indiana. He's working on his instrument rating and is looking to buy a Cirrus. Shane McFarland, he's the mayor of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and since he flies, he calls himself the Air Mayor. Bill Haug flies out of High Sierra Pilots in Carson City and Minden, Nevada. He's working on his CFI and hopes to become a father-son flight instruction team. Joey McCormick, insurance agent and ground instructor in Arkansas. If you live in Arkansas or an adjacent state, call him for a quote on life insurance that covers your private pilot flights. Check him out at flexiblechoiceinsurance.com. Hunter Clark, who's from N-Flight Cam. They make accessories for GoPros. Chris Waters. Kimberly Coons, instrument-rated pilot working on commercial and also multi-engine. Eric Hines runs a new nonprofit called Hope on Short Final that does emergency relief supply flights in response to weather disasters. You can read more about their mission at hopeonshortfinal.org. William McKinney. Rob Parisian, he's an orthopedic surgeon who flies out of KCON in Concord, New Hampshire. Miles Tedder, working on his instrument rating. He just bought a 2020 Cirrus SR-20 Ed Carroll's. Derek Doyle. Philip Dade, who owns a handful of restaurants in Arizona and Utah. Shannon Day has completed his private instrument ratings in the past year at the Scottsdale, Arizona Cirrus Factory Training Center and is building hours and experience in his Cirrus SR-22T while continuing to work on additional ratings and eventually becoming a jet pilot. Scott Sutton, Peter White, Patrick Bennett, David Ford, and Robert Emery. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You